Welcome viewers to this session. In this session, we will be continuing with the yoga philosophy. Many of the concepts that we have discussed in the previous classes on yoga systems. So, I would like to remind you in a very brief, so that it will help you to recapitulate what we have discussed in the last class on yoga philosophy. As you know that yoga and Sankhya, these two systems are consist of one pair. Sankhya is a theoretical approach, gives a theoretical approach about a liberation, about some of the concepts, whereas in yoga philosophy you find its practical aspect. Therefore, in Vedanta and also in some other scriptures you find that there is a text written stating that Sankhya and yoga, the theoretical and practical aspect of some issues or a particular issue. They said that if Sankhya is describing something on some issue and yoga talks about the same thing in a practical standpoint. So, therefore, you find Sankhya and yoga many times you have a crisscrossing references whenever they are discussing on some of the concept. For example, liberation, for example, how to eradicate from the sufferings, for examples, what are the ultimate nature of reality, and many more things. To identify a soul, to identify a self, to describe a self, everything you find both in Sankhya as well as yoga. We also discussed in the last class that what are the differences between Sankhya philosophy and yoga philosophy. While bringing the differences, we said that Sankhya accepts the plurality of selves. However, yoga accepts or confirms that only one and one Purusha, or one and only one God. Sankhya said that there are not only one Purusha, but also there are different Purusha or many Purushas. However, yoga rejects this concept and said that we believe only one and only one Purusha known as God. Further also, if you remember, we have discussed that the stages of yoga. We also said that the psychology aspect of yoga philosophy, and we also discussed that how Chitta is a practical aspect or a practical component of yoga philosophy. We said that Chitta means the three elements put together. One is intellect or buddhi, another is mind or manas, the third one is ego and ahankara. These three elements constitute the Chitta. We have also discussed the stages of Chitta, that how Chitta gets its different stages, and each stage how it differs from other stages. We also said that in Chitta we find these three gunas, that is Sattva, Raja and Tamas. Now in this class we will discuss that how these Sattva, Raja and Tama gunas, these three gunas of Prakriti described in Sankhya philosophy, and how the same thing, that Sattva, Raja, Tama gunas helps the Chitta to occupy in a different form. So, this class we will be discussing the forms of Chitta. After that, we will be discussing that how Chitta get modifies. Chitta never remains as same, because as you know that this Purusha and Prakriti, once they comes close together, the tranquility of three gunas that you find in a Prakriti get vibrates. Henceforth, there are different objects creates and produced in this earth, and Purusha is the only eternal being or super conscious being who is enjoying all the products, and therefore Prakriti also responsible to design the different product for different purposes. Therefore, in yoga philosophy we will discussing that how Chitta get modifies, how this Sattva, Raja, Tama gunas also get modified, so that we find different objects in this world. In addition to that, we will be discussing in this class that how many kleshas are there in this earth. Kleshas means dukkha, means suffering, that human beings, once they born, they are free from everything, but once they grow up, they are associating, they are attaching, and they are relating with each and everyone, in some or other form. Therefore, suffering is obvious in earthly life. Now we will discuss in this class that how yoga philosophy prescribes that once if tries to free from all this suffering, what sort of practice he or she supposed to do, what sort of kleshas, dukkhas or suffering found in this earth, and how one should understand these kinds of sufferings, and how one suffering is different from others, and what are the measures we have to take so that we will be detached from all kind of sufferings and also miseries. Henceforth, our life will be a peaceful life, and even in this present life we will get the liberation. As Sankhya said that there are two kinds of liberation, Jivan Mukti and Vidya Mukti. Jivan Mukti is that kind of a liberation where an individual having a life, whether it is an animal, whether it is a reptiles, anyone, an individual having a life in this earth can also get liberated by practicing so and so. And also they said that, Sankhya philosophy said that there is another kind of liberation known as Vidya Mukti. They said that Vidya Mukti means after the death of a body, nothing is written, nothing is remains, neither body nor the Atman. So in that type, the body as a gross body and the self is a subtle element also not remain in that particular body. That body where that soul is a spirit or the body was in active form was there earlier. Therefore they said that after death we will get also liberation, that is known as Vidya Mukti. In the same form, Yoga said that there are some practices we should do, therefore an individual can also get liberation in this earthly life by fully knowing that the human beings are associating or relating with different individual and different objects for different reasons and different purposes. Yoga philosophy the same way or the similar fashion prescribes that an individual can get liberation in this earthly life by doing some kind of yoga or practices that we will be discussing. Further they said that there are also chances to get pure liberation when an individual dies. Now all these things in together we will be discussing in today's class. Now focusing on the forms of Chitta, as I said that forms of Chitta we will be discussing. Now if you could able to remember that we have discussed what is Chitta and the components of Chitta. There I said Chitta constituted with three elements. One is ego or ahankara, another is mind or manas, and another is intellect or buddhi. These three products together constitute Chitta. He said that Chitta also having three gunas like Prakriti. These three gunas are Sattva, Rajas and Tamas. Sattva is white, Rajas is an active form, and Tamas is a dual form or a very lazy, or its color is black. That means it is a heaviness. So these three kinds of guna you find in Chitta also. Further they said that this dominance of one guna in a product, in an object, therefore suppose you find there is a product, in that product you find one guna dominates the other two gunas. Suppose in a chair you find tamas guna dominates sattva and rajas, because until unless you move the chair is not moving. However, if you see a mirror, you can see your image back, the mirror reflects your image. That means it is a sattva guna which dominates rajas and tamas. If you see that a vehicle is moving, or you are running, or you are walking, that means something is on motion. That means here rajas is a guna and its attribute is active. There rajas guna dominates sattva and tamas. Henceforth you find different objects, different actions and different products have different gunas, and out of these three gunas one guna tries to dominate other two gunas. Therefore different objects you find in this earth for different purposes. They said that also that in Chitta we find three gunas, and also the cases that one guna tries to dominate other two gunas. Henceforth different forms will get of Chitta. Chitta receives different forms because of three gunas are trying to dominate. Three guna tries to dominate each other, or among these three gunas one tries to dominate other two. So now let us discuss what are the forms of chitta. They said that since there are three forms of chitta, we find three forms of chitta because the dominance of nature of one guna on others. These three forms of chitta is known as prakhya, pravruti and sthiti. Now let us discuss what are these three forms of chitta. They said that in prakhya, sattva guna is dominating. However, you find tamas guna remains as subordinate to sattva. That means if something is very clear enough, tamas also tries to subordinate to that. Tamas also tries to be associated with sattva guna. In this case, chitta aspires for different powers of yoga. While somebody is doing some yoga and practices, you find that they will be achieving something. At least they will be able to concentrate their mind. In other form, they can be able to control their sense organs. They can be able to concentrate on a particular object, though the mind fluctuates from one to another. Some siddhi they will get it. It is known as anima also. That means siddhi means once you get something, you have a control on something, that is siddhi. Though your mind will be associating with different objects differently, or your mind is focusing on one point, however, immediately switch over to another point. It is because of these forms where sattva dominates and tamas associates, you are able to concentrate on a particular object for a limited time. They said that also further, so because of these forms, chitta able to receives many information on a particular object and able to identify a particular object as it is. If you are not able to concentrate on an object, how can you identify its features? As a result, if you could not able to identify features of an object, you could not able to recognize that object even as it is, and henceforth you many times commit a mistake by stating that this object is not that. Sometimes we find that there is a rope will be lying on the road and we claim that it is a snake, because when we are seeing the rope, because of the same characteristic of rope and snakes, we think that this is not a rope but a snake. However, in this kind of form, chitta helps you to identify what exactly the nature of the object as it is. As a result, you could able to identify the object as it is with its nature, with its attributes. The second point is known as pravruti. There, in case of pravruti, you find that rajas is dominating the sattva and tamas. However, the tamas guna becomes very weak, but it appears, and this form appears to be enlightened. That means in this case of chitta, when chitta receives this kind of form, here what happens, this rajas guna is an active, this rajas guna tries to dominate tamas and sattva, but further they said that tamas guna is not completely dominated, somehow or other it appears or associate with rajas. Therefore, you find it's a different forms, and in these forms chitta able to achieve something, that is dhyana or dharana. That means if you go for a fasting for 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, that means your stomach always needs to fulfill by eating some of these fruits, vegetables, what is eatable. But in the same time, since you are able to concentrate by your yoga practice, you can able to sit for a longer time, dhyana or dharana. You might be seeing that many people go for a dharana, see hunger strike, they are able to do for a longer time. It is just because they can able to concentrate on a particular task. However, they can also feel hungry while doing this hunger strike, but they protect from the foods, stating that we are not going to eat. Therefore, many times you find that after 1 or 2 day hungry, many people hospitalized. So it is in that time this chitta receives this form. So as a result, we have a dhyana, a Rishi can constantly sit for doing a dhyana for a longer time. We as an ordinary being can have a dharana for 1 or 2 days for some reasons. It is in that time Chitta receives this form. Now coming to the third, there is another form Chitta also receives known as sthiti. In this case, sattva is dominated, the Chitta is predominated by sattva, or sattva dominates the other two gunas rajas and tamas. However, yoga system says that rajas is not completely dominating. Rajas, while dominating, also try to subordinate sattva. In this form, you find that the Chitta conceives its own form and try to differentiate from others. That means, in this form, the form of the last one, as we have discussed, where sattva is dominating other two, however, rajas is subordinating sattva. In this case, you find that Chitta will be getting a different form altogether. In that form, the Chitta try to differentiate from others, because there is a different form of Chitta. Being living in this earth, your existence you feel not like in this earthly life. That means, after constant practice of yoga, somebody may find that he or she not working in this earthly life, something above that. The spirit makes you to feel that you are not like an ordinary being, because you are not attaching with any of the objects for your passion, for your cravings, for your life, luxury life. He is saying that because of this form, Chitta able to discriminate. That means, you find as a human being exceptional from others. That means, whatever you are able to gain, whatever knowledge you can infer, that other beings cannot be inferred. That kind of human beings, after doing some kind of yoga practice, can also be reached to that stage. Henceforth, they said that any human being reached to that stage, in that time the Chitta receives the form, the last form, where sattva is dominating these two rajas and tamas, however, rajas try to subordinate sattva. So these are three forms of Chitta we have discussed now. Now we will see that the modification of Chitta, that why at all Chitta needs to modify it, and once it is modified, what are things Chitta receives further. For example, if you try to modify yourself, you can also gain many things. If you try to modify further, you can also learn many more things. Somebody is designing some PowerPoint. If he or she tries to modify it further, then it can be more sharper and more wisely it can be created. If you read some passage, if you further also modify the passage, that means if you write that, after reading that passage, if you write something on your notebook, whatever you have understood, further if you can modify that writing, you will find in a stage where your writing will be very, very good one in comparison to the earlier one. Therefore, whenever there is a modification, it receives a different shape, different forms. Now the question arises, why at all Chitta needs a modification? If at all Chitta needs modification, what kind of modification Chitta has? And at all Chitta modifies, what are the forms Chitta is occupying? Now let us discuss the modification of Chitta. As I said that sattva, raja, tamas, these three gunas are found in Chitta, and Chitta associate with different objects differently, because each gunas tries to dominate other two gunas. Henceforth, each object, each human being is unique from others. You find that there are many cases twins. However, though they appear as the same, but they behave certainly different. As a result, we could able to identify X is different from Y, though X and Y are twins, because the three gunas somehow or other differentiates or try to dominate others in a different proportion. As a result, you find that everyone has its own unique features. As a result, we identify the object or an individual in a unique name. We never say that chair is a table, or table is a desk, or desk is a computer. We never say. We are able to discriminate and also demarcate, saying that table cannot be a chair. Table is different from chair. The attribute of table is different from the attribute of chair. The attribute of a human being is different from the attribute of an animal. The attribute of an animal is different from the attribute of a bird or insects or reptiles. So therefore, the modification of Chitta involved in different life differently. Henceforth, we identify an individual as an unique and differing from others. Now let us discuss. The Chitta gets modified or changed and acquires the consciousness due to the reflection of the Purusha or the self. As I said, in Sankhya philosophy also it was described in this form. When Sankhya philosophy claims that there are many Purushas, there is not only one Purusha, what they said, what they mean is that there is only one Purusha which is eternal and pure consciousness, but inactive. But while creation happens, different products created in this earth, the Prakriti being a matter or the real cause try to associate, relate with Purusha. Their connection, they are just coming closer with each other, Purusha and Prakriti. The some part of consciousness of Purusha is a spirit form or a force form find in all of this life that we are having in this earth. That means when Purusha Prakriti comes together, Prakriti being a matter and Purusha being the consciousness, they comes close together and henceforth one product created. And if that product has a life or able to take breath, then some part of consciousness derives from Purusha. However, once the product created, Purusha dissociated from that product. So therefore, you find different animals, different human beings and also different other creatures in this earth. In the same fashion, yoga philosophy prescribes that the self that we have and the self seeking for the liberation, or the self suffers because we think that we are an individual, and Chitta makes us to understand that we have an ego, we have ahankara and we have intellect. Though whatever we have, the self or a life, it is derived from the pure consciousness or Purusha, but still since Purusha is dissociated from this life, but we cannot directly see the Purusha, we said that we are one of the jiva. Therefore, we have a ego, we have a intellect, and because of the ego we think that we are the Purusha, one among the other Purushas, but which is not the case. They had also given an example, like everyone see that moon, and whenever they will walk on the road, they think that moon is walking with them, but this is not so. It is because of ignorance we think that moon is walking with us in the night, and every human also feels in the same way. However, this is not true. Moon is one because of some part of moon, this power or force, we think that we moves as well as moon also moves. Keeping in this mind, they said that modification of Chitta also happen in the same form, because when the jiva or the soul receives for an object or used for a different purpose or engaged in different actions, Chitta also get modifies. Chitta receives in different forms. Therefore, they said that though the Chitta modifies, changes and acquires consciousness due to the reflection of Purusha's self, however, the real nature of Chitta is a material, because the Chitta is itself comes from the matter, is known as Prakriti. Prakriti is a material, but it is unconsciousness. However, since it is association or receives some kind of power from the Purusha, it receives some consciousness or receives some life. Therefore, Chitta is material when the product of Prakriti find in Chitta, and it is also having life, or it is known as self. Chitta also has a self only when it realizes that some part of consciousness lies in Chitta in the form of self. So therefore, Chitta in one hand is material, and another hand is said that having self, therefore consciousness. The changes in Chitta, any changes you find in Chitta are known as modification of Vritti. There are 5 modifications found in Chitta. Now, let us discuss what are the 5 modifications. Now, the 5 modifications are pramana, viparjaya, vikalpa, nidra and smruti. Pramana means it is a valid knowledge or the right cognition. Viparjaya means sometimes it is understood as doubt or wrong cognition. The third one, vikalpa, is known as imagination. That means since we have a self and our product is from Prakriti, we would be able to imagine something. The self is received some consciousness and this consciousness engaged in the yoga actions or yoga practices. Henceforth, we could be able to imagine something very concretely, and many times we imagine which is very abstract, but yoga helps us to imagine something or to have an inferential knowledge about some object in a little bit concrete form. The fourth one, they said that nidra, that means whenever we sleep also we receive some kind of information. The chitta also modifies in that time. And the last one, they said that smruti or memory, when the memory also functions, chitta also get modifies. Many cases you find that you mistakenly identify someone as a different person, however, whenever you interact with him by reaching to him or her, you find that whatever you thought about him or her, that person is not that person to whom you are meeting. In that time, chitta also modifies. Now, let us discuss in a very detailed way what are these 5, what are the 5 kinds of chitta when it modifies. Now, first one is pramana. As I said, yoga school like Sankhya, they address the 3 kind of pramana. Pramana means the valid source of knowledge. The first one is that perception, any knowledge that you receives by seeing an object. Seeing object means the 5 sense organs associated with that object or interact with that object or attached with that object. That any knowledge you get through 5 sense organs, yoga philosophy considers as a perception. They also consider that whatever mind receives or whatever mind infer, intuitive knowledge also a valid knowledge, because for them perceptions can be done through 5 sense organs as well as the 6 sense organs known as mind. Therefore, they said that any knowledge that we receive through perception, that can be a valid pramana. Secondly, they said that inferential knowledge can be a valid pramana. That means any knowledge that you received by inferring something, that can be valid knowledge. And further, they said that like Sankhya philosophy, they said that verbal testimony can be a source of right knowledge or valid knowledge. And you know what is meant by perception, what is meant by inference, and what are the components required to have an inference. As I said that inference, to have an inference we need 3 components, that means major term, minor term and middle term. Major term in the major premise, minor term in the minor premise, and the last premise is known as conclusion. In the conclusion you find major term and minor term, however the middle term is connecting the major premise and minor premise. Therefore, at least 3 propositions we require to have an inference. Further, they said that inference is a concomitance relation, is a concomitance universal, invariable relation between hetu and sadhya. Hetu is a middle term and sadhya is the major term. So, between middle term and major term there should be a concomitance universal and invariable relation should be found, then only inference will be a correct one or a valid one. The same thing prescribed by yoga philosophy. Further, if you said that verbal testimony, they said that the testimony that we receive in a verbal form can also be considered as a valid knowledge. Now, let us discuss in a brief that how really they have discussed about it. When I said brief, means we are not going to elaborate very elastically. Brief means whatever is required we will be discussing on it. They said that in the case of perception, the chitta through sense organs, both external as well as internal, here is a mind, comes into contact with external objects of the world and assumes its forms. That means whenever the sense organs comes to contact with the physical object, let us say now I can touch to the towel and I feel the hardness. Now I can touch to the water and can claim that it is a liquid. I can see that there are gases. Therefore, they said that any knowledge that you receive through the sense organs, that will be a valid knowledge, and these 5 sense organs contacting with any of the object and you receive the knowledge about that object can be considered as a valid knowledge about that object. This is about the perception yoga philosophy claims. They said that in case of inferences, the Chitta recognizes the generic nature of objects, and this is equally applicable to verbal testimony also. What is the generic nature? I will give an example so that it will help you to understand what is the generic nature. Yoga philosophy claims that inferential knowledge, but they said that to have an inferential knowledge, we must know the general nature of it. That means the uniformity should be maintained all the times. For example, a person see a smoke in the distant hill and claim that there might be a fire over there. What yoga philosophy claims that if that person had seen that wherever there is a smoke there is a fire, in example like kitchen you have seen there is a smoke, there is a fire. In candle there is a smoke and there is a fire. In lamp there is a smoke and there is fire. Therefore, the person who is claiming that by seeing a smoke in the distant hill there is a fire, he or she must know that this fire and smoke must be associated in all the circumstances. So therefore, there should be generality of the nature in a cause effect form should found, then only we are able to claim something inferentially, and that claiming on that inferential knowledge should be valid only when the generality feature will be found. If any of the situation if the person finds that smoke and fire is not related with each other, or just have see the smoke without fire or have seen the fire without smoke, then he or she if claims that wherever there is a smoke there is a fire, then it is not a valid inference. Therefore, they said they given an example like, you see crow X is black, crow Y is black, crow Z is black. Therefore, in all the situation circumstances, if any crow will come as a bird, that bird will be black. So therefore, the generality of nature should be maintained in a uniform form within uniformity. This is meant by yoga philosophy. Further, when they say that verbal testimony, they said that the testimony we receive can be considered as a verbal testimony. However, one person should know that who is to be reliable and whose utterances can be entertained to be considered as a valid knowledge. For example, if a person wants to cross the river, now he is standing in the bank of the river and find 3 persons. One is a fisherman, another is a person standing with a bicycles, another person just enjoying the nature wearing a good dress. In that case, immediately the person who wants to cross the river will ask about the river, the water of the river or the depth of the river to the fisherman, but certainly not by the 2 other persons. Though these 2 other persons may have some knowledge about the river's water as well as the depth of the river. However, the person will consider the knowledge about the river as a valid knowledge based on whatever the fisherman will speak about the river or the depth of the river. So therefore, the person who wants to cross the river can identify with the reliable person and whether his or her utterances on a certain fact or issue will be considered as valid or not. So in this way, there are 3 kinds of pramanas accepted by yoga philosophy, and Chitta also helps to receive the knowledge about the object through these are the means. Now moving further, we will be discussing that viparjaya. Viparjaya means doubt. When doubt arises, when we are not sure about a particular object, then doubt arises. Now we will see what in that time how Chitta modifies and how Chitta receives the form when there is a doubt. Here I said the expression viparjaya is understood as doubt. To possess indeterminate knowledge of an object is known as doubt. That means whenever we identify an object we cannot determine its a particular nature. We always in a confusion, this could be called in another object, or this is not the same thing that we are able to identify. Henceforth, we are in a doubt. They said that viparjaya arises when we are doubting on a particular object, we are not able to identify an object as it is, or we are not able to sure about a certain issue. For example, seeing an object and not able to recognize whether it is a cell or a silver. This really resulted in doubt, and in that time also Chitta modifies, because Chitta is not able to help you or guide you to identify a particular object, because in that time maybe Chitta either in Chitta Tamas guna may be dominating, say Rajas and Sattva. As a result, you are not able to really identify. Or in many cases, Rajas guna may be dominating Sattva and Tamas, because Rajas, since involved in activity, your mind will be moving so fast that you may be omitting many of these attributes of that object. As a result, you could not able to identify that object as it is. So here also Chitta get modified. Now further, we find Vikalpa. Vikalpa is an imagination, as you have discussed. It is the knowledge in which the object is known, but the object does not exist. That means you imagine many things in the life, but certainly all the imagination does not exist. For example, you imagine that there is a milk sea, because you know what is milk and you know what is sea. Now it helps you. Now in the mind you can also think of some river which can color is white. So therefore you can call that sea as a milk sea. Therefore yoga philosophy claims that we the human being can imagine, and it helps, and Chitta helps us to imagine also. However, all the imagination need not be exist in a particular form. We cannot identify that this is a milk sea. However, we can get a form or a shape or understanding of a milk sea, and here also Chitta involved to imagine certain things. They further said that this imagination treated as merely a verbal cognition. That means whenever I say milk sea, it is understood, but I cannot refer to an sea or a river saying that, see, there is so much water and now this is a milk sea. Another example they have given stating that barren woman's child. When I say that barren woman's child, you can understand. That means a barren woman cannot produce a child, cannot give a birth of a child. However, the concept, the imagination can be understood, because it is utterances that I uttered and explain, henceforth you understand. So therefore, in this imagination also Chitta modifies. This is known as Vikalpa. Now the another state is Smriti. In memory or Smriti is known as memory, where the Chitta helps to recapitulate or recollect some of the past experience that we had, because some of the in past experiences our impressions lies on that particular fact or a particular object. I am repeating, when you are able to recapitulate some of the information, what happens is that this recapitulation is possible through our impressions that we left on the object while cognized. I will give an example which will help you to understand. For example, you have seen a tree, say long back. You have seen a tree in a particular place long back. Now after a few years, you could be able to recognize that tree and claim that, oh, I have seen that tree long back. That means when you had seen that tree in the past, your impression found on that object very, very categorically, or you determined that object in a particular form. In that time, Chitta helps you to identify that object as it is. Once you identify that object as it is, some kind of impression left in your mind, and this is written in Chitta. And whenever that issue pops up about that tree, you could be able to recapitulate that information, and it is because of Chitta modification you could be able to identify that tree as it is when you had seen in a long back. Further, there are many cases also we may not able to recapitulate many of the information. That in that case, yoga philosophy claims that whenever you identify that object in the past, your impression may not be that strong one. Therefore, this is not written in the Chitta, and though Chitta is striving to get that information, could not able to retrieve all the information. Hence, in imagination, even in doubt, even in smriti, chitta really operates. Another example I will give. Suppose in the dream, suppose in the night you slept and you had a nice dream. In the morning you get up and say that I had a so and so dream. How are you able to recapitulate all the information? You are in the subconscious stage when you are slept. Here yoga philosophy prescribes that it is because of chitta you are able to recapitulate some of the information. Otherwise, in the slept, whatever you had seen in the dream form, you are not able to recapitulate. So therefore, chitta also modifies when somebody slept. Now the last we will be discussing nidra. Nidra is a mental modification where there will be no cognition. It is the knowledge of the absence of objects. In this stage, the chitta is predominated by tamas, because you have a dreamless sleep many times. But however, this stage won't be ignored the mild presence of knowledge while somebody is in sleep. This is so because after waking up from sleep, the person has consciousness that he had slept well and knew nothing. Therefore, some sort of modifications are occurred even in sleep. An extreme case can be given, an example. For example, in the night you slept and you had not any sleep, you had not have any dreams in the night, right? But in the morning when you get up, when you find in the conscious form, you said that, or you find that, oh my God, in the last night I had a dog sleep. I did not even remember anything in my sleep. That means, though it was in a subconscious stage, chitta modifies. Otherwise, how can you say that the last night you had a dog sleep, or you slept such a deep manner that you could not able to recapitulate what happened in the last night, though many things was happening in and around in your bed or in that room. Therefore, it is said that chitta also modifies when somebody is in deep sleep. In this way, you find chitta also helps the human being to identify different objects differently for different purposes. And also, chitta always attached with the human beings. It is find in the self. We the human being have a self, and it is the self guides the chitta to identify a different object differently. This is the way that yoga philosophy describes about the modification of chitta. Now, as I said that we the human beings associating with different objects differently, because different objects fulfill the different purposes for us. Since there are several causes responsible for the disturbances in chitta, chitta never finds a tranquility position, because we the human beings, the self guides the chitta to attach the different objects differently. Hence, it never in a state of tranquility, rather it get disturbed, it modifies even in each moment. Among those, a few are attachment with objects of the world, cognizing the objects wrongly, inactivity, doubt, carelessness, all this helps where chitta modifies differently. When you attach to a chair, your chitta modifies differently, because chitta helps you to identify that object as a chair. When you identify, when your chitta is associated with a computer, you identify that object is a computer and it is different from chair. So therefore, in every case chitta modifies. When you cognize some object differently, which is not its nature, or you have missed many of the attributes of that object and identify mistakenly, there also chitta modifies. Therefore, he is saying that we all suffer because of the chitta, and it is the self, it is the ignorant self guides the chitta to modify every moment, because it is the self which helps us to identify the object by the help of chitta. Therefore, we suffer, and the human being really suffers and get different kind of pain in this earthly life. Now, yoga philosophy claims how to eradicate from all this suffering, how to know that we are ignorant, how to stop the actions which are not good, what practice one should do so that can refrain from all the sufferings, can able to guide the chitta to live in a very tranquility position, not always disturbing. Now all this we will discuss now. These causes, the causes as I said, we are attaching to the different objects differently. We cognize the objects also mistaken as not with its nature. We cognize the object differently. Also we involved in different inactivity. We doubt many things because we are not certain about certain, we are not sure about certain objects, and these all this helps the chitta to disturb. So therefore they said that these are the causes arise because chitta imagines itself as the agent and the enjoyer because Purusha's reflection on it. Chitta does all this because of the self, and chitta and self both together thinks that they are having life because they are consciousness. They forget to know that this consciousness, a very little person, derives from the Purusha, and this is the true ignorance, and this is the ground of the ignorance where human beings or the life in this earthly life gets suffer. Even in an ant, even in a bird, even in a reptile also suffers because of this ego and ahankara. Thus they said that we find the earthly suffering known as kleshas. Kleshas are of 5 types. One is avidya, ignorance, another is asmita, egoism, third one is raga or attachment, fourth one is dvesha or aversion, then abhinivesha, that means clinging or attaching for a long life, and fear of death. Now let us discuss all these components. Here they said that avidya arises when we recognize the self as non-eternal and material. That means we are ignorant, we think that the self is an eternal always, and it is a pure consciousness. It has nothing to do with material object. Once the human body dies, it receives in a different body. It is not the case. This is not the case. Self has neither beginning nor end. It is avidya. Because of avidya we think that self is eternal. However, self is not eternal. Self derives from the Purusha. If Purusha wants, self can cease to exist. Therefore, it is our ignorance or ego helps us to identify or cognize the self as non-eternal. The life of us is an eternal, but which is not the case. Therefore, we must by the yoga practice consider that the self is an eternal one. The self which is a pure consciousness, the Purusha or the God which is a pure consciousness is an eternal one, and the life that we are having is a non-eternal one. One must make a distinction between material and spiritual. One should find a distinction between self and the body, then only some kind of suffering we can refrain from that. Further they said that the real nature of the self is bliss, eternal, and possesses pure consciousness, that is Purusha. One should understand this Purusha and henceforth can make a differentiate the Purusha from Prakriti. The second point, asmita, is wrongly identifying Purusha and Prakriti and further bringing them in an equal platform. Asmita, what happens? According to yoga philosophy, they said that in case of asmita, we all the human beings having self, having modification of chitta in all the times, we think that Purusha and Prakriti both are responsible for creating the different objects in this earth, and matter also some part of find in our body. See, we all human beings or animals having life in this earth has a body, that is a part of matter, and this life is from Purusha. Many people do not be able to discriminate what is the matter, which part of body or which part of elements from a earthly life comes from matter and which part of earthly life comes from Purusha. Due to the misunderstanding of this Purusha Prakriti, many people claim, or many jiva claims that Purusha Prakriti are same. Though they are eternal, they are not same. One should understand that Prakriti is an active, unconscious or jada and a material cause for all productions. However, Purusha is a pure consciousness and active. As a result, you find different objects, both animate and inanimate, in this earth. Because of their closeness, we find different objects, both animate and inanimate, in this earth. And one should know that. Therefore, they should know that what is Purusha and how it is different from Prakriti. This knowledge one must have, and a self must have, so that the chitta should not be found in a disturbance position, it should be found in a tranquility. At least the chitta can be controlled. Now further they said that raga is the craving to get worldly pleasure like power and money. Once you have a angerness, that means you are hankering or you try to get much money or much power or much pleasure in this life, and one should not do that. And how one should control from this? By doing some kind of practice or yoga. So therefore they have prescribed some kind of yoga that we will be going to discuss in the next class. What kind of yoga one should do so that he or she can refrain from all this raga, which will be really tempt us to earn more money or chase to receive much power, so that we can do many actions with our all ego. Further they said dvesa, that means a desire. Dvesa is anger in the means of suffering. That means if you think that you are suffering, again you say that why I am suffering. Based on your suffering you feel another suffering, because by searching out why you are suffering you get further anger. Suppose some disturbances happen with you, again you think that why such all this disturbance happening to me, how I am treating as bad, though I am not doing any bad actions. By thinking of this, that means somebody suffers, and by thinking of that suffering, that why at all I am suffering, get demotivated, there also is known as dvesa, and this can also be eradicated if somebody understands how the suffering can be removed from all by practicing some of the yoga. Though there are different kind of suffering, by practicing yoga this can be controlled, this can be instructed properly, so that we human beings, the earthly life human beings, can be detached from suffering and kleshas. The last point, they said that abhinivesa is the fear of death which finds among all living beings in this earth. What it means? That we all living beings, we think that we have unlimited life, we never realize that we have a limited life, and this life is given by Purusha and is derived from Purusha and matter. Once the body perishes, the life goes away. We never know that. We think that at best we can enjoy in the whole life and the life will be eternal. Therefore in the next birth also we can enjoy our life, and this is the cause we also suffer. That is known as abhinivesa. He is saying that fear of death. Anytime you think something about this, you think that oh my God, I will die. If I do that, I will die. But which is not the case. Even to think of your death, it is also one of the cause responsible for suffering. That means suppose you are living in a happy life, again you think that if you go somewhere, if you do some action, then again you will die. In other words, you think that after some time you will die, therefore again you suffer. You think that what action I should do, at the which moment, how you should be rich, how you should enjoy much pleasure, all this. Therefore again the suffering starts. Because of the death, the nearness of death, you think immediately and try to do many actions in between in a very limited period, and henceforth your activity engaged in different actions which was not expected. Therefore sufferings continue. So in this way yoga philosophy prescribes that one can control from all these sufferings. Thank you. And the next class we will discuss what are the yoga practices one must do to detach or to refrain from all the suffering. Thank you.